Good evening, everyone. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. I see a couple more people logging on, so we'll get started here in just a second. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. One thing I do want to make you aware of before we get going is that in this particular webinar, we do have a chat button that's at the top of your menu, or maybe at the bottom, depending on what version of Zoom you're using. But you can use the chat feature to ask any questions that you have, as well as the Q&A button. Feel free to utilize that as well. And we will have time for questions and answers at the end of tonight's presentation. However, if you do have a question in real time, please feel free to go ahead and ask that. And if I see it in the moment while we're doing the presentation, I'll be glad to pause and address it at that time as well. So what we're talking about tonight, we recently had the score releases. And so, if you're someone who did not get the score that you were looking for on your most recent exam, we want to talk about, well, what are the next steps to help you get to that passing score that you're seeking? And so that's kind of the focus of tonight and what we're going to go over. Now, some of the items that we're going to discuss related to that relate to the psychological factors that sometimes impact your ability to pass, as well as some planning tips. Excuse me, I have a little typo there, but some planning tips there. And then also, we want to highlight the structure of the exam so that you understand some of the nuanced elements of it that you may not have known before you took the exam that may help you in the future. And then we're going to give you some specific strategies as it relates to going through the multiple choice questions and the simulations, and also talk a little bit about your prometric experience. So, the first thing to know, we talked about some of the psychological aspects. One of the important things to know is that this is nothing to beat yourself up over. So the CPA exam, it depends on what section you're taking, but on average, there's about a 50% pass rate nationally for people who take the CPA exam. There are a lot of people who don't pass on their first attempt, but they end up passing the next time. And so once you become a CPA, nobody really knows or cares how long it took you to get there. Our main goal with Surgent is we want you to be able to pass on your first attempt, or even if you've taken it once but didn't get the score you're looking for, we want to help you pass on that second attempt because we know that it's a time-consuming process. It can be expensive to take the exams. And so we do want you to pass as quickly as possible for that reason. But from a big picture standpoint, this is not something to be discouraged about and think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't even pursue the rest of this credential. There are lots of people who did not pass the first time, but then they end up passing the next time and moved on to become CPAs. And so that's the first thing. Let's keep a positive mindset and don't stray away from this process. So the next thing that you want to look at are figuring out, well, what are the reasons that you may not have passed this exam? And so we're going to talk about lack of preparedness, and specifically, we're going to address what we mean by lack of preparedness, because it might not be exactly what you have in mind at the moment. So when we talk about lack of preparedness, there are a few different ways that we can break that down. So one of the elements of that is focus. And so just to give you kind of a practical example, I am the type of person that when I study, I need to be in a room by myself, free of distractions. I can't have the TV on. I really do better when I don't even have the phone in my room because, those types of things can just be distractions for me. I don't do well in study groups. And because I tend to want to talk or just get a little bit distracted. And so for me, I focus best when I am in a room by myself. There are other individuals that focus best when they are in a study group or when they're in a public space like a coffee shop or something like that. What you have to do is figure out what is the best atmosphere for you to be able to study. So think back to when you were in school, think back to even when you're working in your careers. What were the type of environments that allowed you to be as efficient and effective as possible as you were either studying or completing your work? So that's one thing there as well. The other thing is motivation. So we want you to think about, why are you taking this exam? So, and let me advance to a couple other slides here to talk about your motivation. So why are you taking this exam? So one, we want to figure out, you know, there are a couple things really. The one here, it says, how motivated are you to study? But part of that gets into this last bullet here. Who are you doing this for? Are you doing this for you, or are you doing this for your parents because they want you to pass this exam? Are you doing it for your employer or your spouse or somebody like that? And one of the things I want to highlight here is that none of these reasons are wrong. But what you need to do is utilize this why, utilize this reason as you're studying. So anytime you feel discouraged or don't want to study or don't feel like doing it, think back to, you know what, if, you know, when I pass this exam, I'm going to get a bonus with my employer. When I pass this exam, my spouse is going to be so happy. My kids are going to be so proud. My parents are going to be so proud. Or if this is strictly for you, you know, you may say, once I set this goal in mind, and I'm really just going to get a great sense of accomplishment once I finish it. Whatever that reason is, hold on to that throughout your study process and make sure that you utilize your why as you are focusing and trying to make sure that you stay motivated to pass the exam. A couple of other things that I want to highlight here is, you know, it says, does it work with your lifestyle and study style? So one of the things that we have to do is figure out, you know, when you're studying for the exam, we all have busy lives, whether it is dealing with family or maybe school or work. We have a lot going on in our lives. And so you need to figure out, is the course that you're using or the way that you're using the existing course, whatever that is, whether it's us or one of the competitors, you need to figure out, does it fit with your lifestyle and your study style? And so I'm going to share a little bit of information later and as it relates to kind of personalizing that study schedule for you so that you could really make it fit into your lifestyle. But that's something that I want you all to evaluate because it's very difficult to juggle all the demands of studying for one of these exams while also dealing with everything else going on in life. So a couple of other things here related to focus. You know, I already talked about studying where and how you can focus. And so again, I'm not the type of person who can have the TV on, or I can't even study on the couch because I may want to fall asleep or something like that. And so again, just figure out what is the best atmosphere for you to study. Another thing that's really important is your ability to take a sabbatical from your social life. So one of the challenges, even for someone like me, is, you know, I get invited to go places, not quite as much right now with COVID, but typically I would get invited to go places or attend events and things like that. And it's really difficult to say no because you don't want to offend your friends or your family. And so one of the things that I recommend is saying, you know what, I'm going to build this into my study schedule. I'm giving myself 1 day a week for social life. And so every Friday, I'm on board to go out with my friends or just hang out with whoever. But other than that, I'm not really going to be focused on going to those types of activities. One of the things that I recommend is approaching your friends and family from the beginning and letting them know, hey, I have a goal to pass all 4 sections of the CPA exam within 18 months. This is going to be a challenging process. And what I need from you is to be supportive and also help me stay on focus. Bring them into the process and make them part of your cheerleading squad. You want to bring them in and say, look, you know, I'm a social person. I love hanging out with you. I love going to the birthday parties. I love doing this or that. But right now, I really need to focus, and I may not be able to go to all those things, but you know, I'm going to be tempted to do it. And so I really need you to make sure that I stay on track. I want you to be my accountability partner. You know, help me make sure that I'm staying focused. So if I say, hey, let's go out and let's do this or that, I want you to challenge me and say, hey, how's studying going? Are you sure that's a good idea? Bring them into your process. And so that way, if you do it on the front end, they're not offended and feeling like, oh, this person just dropped off the face of the earth, or they're, you know, I feel like there's some tension between us because the last few times I've invited them out, they've made an excuse as to why they can't come. Go ahead and have those conversations up front, and it will take a little bit of the pressure off as you're trying to build out your study schedule and that sort of thing. Another thing is reevaluating how you approach social media. So this may not be an issue for all of you, but I will just be honest. The way social media is structured, it is designed to suck you in and keep you in. So the most of our news feeds are tailored to our interests. So I'm seeing things. I'm a big sports fan, so a lot of the things that populate in my news feed are related to sports. And so when I see those things pop in, I want to read those articles. When I see posts from my close friends and families, I want to click on those posts and see the photos and read the stories. So it's really designed to cater to your interests. And so sometimes I'll tell myself, oh, I'm just going to log in for 2 to 3 minutes and check on things, see if there are any major updates. But then I look up and it's an hour later and I'm still on my phone or at a computer. And so so it's important to reevaluate how you approach social media, because sometimes it is good to just kind of take a break and say, right now, I'm going to make, you know, maybe Fridays are my social media days. I'm not going to be on it the rest of the time because I realize it can derail my study schedule. I plan to start studying at 7 p.m. I got on my phone at 6:55. The next thing I know, it's 8 and I haven't started studying yet. And now I'm getting a little tired and hungry. So now I'm going to get something to eat. And after I finish eating, now I'm sleepy, I'm just going to go ahead and go to bed and maybe watch TV or something. And then you've missed an entire study night all because of social media. Again, that's not something that is going to be an issue for all of you, but we're just going over a few things that are some common hurdles and roadblocks that sometimes get people off their intended schedule or intended track for studying and preparing for the exam. Now, one other thing to note, and you know, it says don't continue to study if you are sleepy, hungry, or generally grouchy. So what we're referring to there is, I don't know about you, but sometimes if I do have those urges to eat or sleep or something like that, I may spend the hours or the time studying, but I'm not retaining anything because mentally I'm not really focused on what I'm doing. I'm not thinking about the actual work that I'm putting in. And so again, this is why it's very important to be regimented. If you plan to study from 7 to 9 p.m., you need to make plans to go ahead and have dinner or whatever it is between 6 and 6:30 or something like that, because you don't want to start at 7 and say, well, now I'm starting to get a headache because I'm hangry and, you know, that sort of thing. And so go ahead and make your plans and just structure everything to where you can avoid these types of issues. But if you're not feeling well, it's probably best to just go ahead and get some rest and then try again for the next day. But you want to do this. So make sure, if you were intending to study 2 hours tonight, but you have a bad headache and so you just feel like now's not a good time, go ahead and look at your calendar and figure out, okay, when am I going to replace those hours? Because if I'm typically studying 4 days per week and I just lost this night of study, you need to build that in on one of those other days. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind. So that's one important element to consider as well. Okay, the next thing is evaluating your study plan. So with the general study plans, most people say they need about 5 to 6 weeks of study per section of the CPA exam, and they generally study about 15 to 20 hours per week. Now, granted, with our system, our times are a little bit less. And the main reason for that is because it's personalized to you. So some individuals may actually need this amount of time to study. Other individuals may be able to do it in less time, because what we do is start you off with an assessment. That assessment identifies your strengths and your weaknesses so that you have a better idea of what specific content you need to be focused on studying. If there's something that you are already an expert in, if you already know that 2 plus 2 is 4, then I don't want you watching a bunch of videos on simple addition. You already know that. And so let's move on to something that's a little bit more complex, because when you can improve on those weaknesses, that's what's going to raise your score. So one of the things I would recommend, if you're looking at your score report, go ahead and take a look at which categories you scored the lowest in. And so when you go into our system, I would encourage you to make those the primary sections that you say, okay, here's how I'm going to reapproach this. I'm going to work on trying to build up my scores in those particular categories, because that's where I had the most difficulty. So those are a few things to consider there. So you want to look at how often are you studying, and do you need a day off? So one of the things with needing a day off, sometimes I've been guilty of this as well. Sometimes it sounds great on paper to say, I'm going to study 7 days a week for 5 hours a day. But in truth, it's just typically not realistic, because there's an energy factor. So you may not always have the energy to do it. And sometimes there's just a burnout factor. There's mental fatigue that you can experience. So sometimes you may not have failed this exam because you didn't study enough. Sometimes you may have overstudied because you just mentally got drained. And by the time the exam rolled around, you were just mentally fatigued and really worn out. And so I would encourage you to build in at least one day or one day off that you're not studying. So generally, I would say you want to be studying somewhere between 4 to 6 days per week. But I definitely would not recommend 7, because it's just a little bit too intense. And so that's one thing that I want to make you aware of as well. And then again, going back to this focus, how effective is your study time? Sometimes you can spend a lot of time studying something, but you can actually study in fewer hours if you're really intentional and focused. There are times where mentally I'm not really focused, and I can read a paragraph or a page, and then I look up at the end of the page and I say, I don't remember a single thing that I just read. And it's because, yes, my body was physically there looking, my eyes were looking at the page or looking at the screen, but mentally I just wasn't there. And so we want to make sure that you are locked in and focused. And so sometimes 1 hour of study time can be more effective than 2 hours of non-focused study time. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well, figuring out how effective is your study time. So what we want you to do when you're looking at building out your study plan, the first 3 weeks that you're studying, we want you to be doing at least 50 to 60 questions per day. And when I say per day, that's per day that you're in the system studying. So not saying 50 to 60 all 7 days, but just however many days per week you say you can study. Each time you log into the system, we want you doing about 50 to 60 multiple choice questions per day. After a couple of weeks, you can start on the simulations. And then I would recommend doing about 4 simulations per day. The simulations generally take somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. So we're talking about maybe 40 minutes to an hour just on simulations. But the simulations are almost like a compound multiple choice question. So that's why we generally want people to start out mastering the multiple choice first and then moving into the simulations. With where you are, being someone who's already taken the exam, you might be able to, you probably don't have to repeat this entire process. You'll really want to evaluate, how close were you to passing? Because if you failed the exam with a 40, you might have a little bit more work to do than someone who failed the exam with a 73. And so if you failed with a 73 or something along those lines, then you might just have a little bit more to study, a little bit more to tweak. And I would encourage you to retake the exam pretty quickly, because there may be a lot of information in your head that you want to retain. And so you don't want to wait a month and a half or 2 months and let some of that information get stale. Go ahead and stay in the system. And that way that will set you up for success when you're taking it the next time. Now, this other piece here, we talk about at least 1 week before the exam, go back and redo all of your simulations that you had low scores in. And the reason for that is the simulations count for 50% of your score. So even if you're doing exceptionally well on the multiple choice questions, if you haven't mastered the simulations, you're unlikely to get the score that you desire because of the way that it is structured. Another thing that we recommend around that time frame is please do at least one practice exam, preferably two if you have time. But those are 4-hour practice exams that we have in our system. And one of the other things that we are recommending right now is that you actually wear a mask while you're doing that practice exam. As you probably know, depending on when you last took the exam, most of the prometric testing centers are requiring you to wear a mask in the testing center. And so we want you to understand what it feels like to take an exam for 4 hours wearing a mask. What does it feel like around your ears? How is your breathing? You can't see me right now, but I wear glasses. And sometimes when I put on a mask, my glasses will fog up. Well, we don't want you experiencing those little troubleshooting issues during the actual exam and then saying, okay, how do I reposition my glasses? How do I reposition my mask so that this isn't creating an issue? We want you to simulate as much of the exam experience beforehand as possible. And so that's why I would highly recommend wearing a mask, just so you can understand what that feels like and it doesn't throw you off your game when you get to the testing center. I have spoken with a couple of individuals who said, and some of them, even whether they passed or not, some of them did pass, but they did acknowledge it was weird taking an exam for that long with a mask on, and it was a bit of a distraction for me. And so that may or may not have been something that played into your exam experience. But if it did, just wanted to give you that tip to consider wearing a mask while you're doing your practice exams at home. Okay, so another thing is we want you to, as best as possible, commit to your exam date and don't reschedule unless you absolutely have to. So there are a couple of reasons for that. So one, if you reschedule within 30 days, so within 5 to 30 days, you do have to pay a fee to reschedule. It's about $35. And then if it's less than 5 days, you actually are still responsible for the full price of the exam, even if you reschedule it. And so that's one reason. We don't want you paying extra money or losing the entire amount of your exam fees. And so that's one reason not to reschedule. The other part is understanding the 18-month expiration window. So once you pass your first exam, you have 18 months to pass the remaining 3 sections. And the more you reschedule or delay things, the less likely it will be that you're able to pass all 4 parts within 18 months. And so that's why we really want you to hold firm to your exam date. The other reason, I don't have this listed on the slide, but the other reason is that psychologically, when we have in our minds that rescheduling is an option, it gives us permission to not study. So sometimes I'll tell myself, you know what? I'm planning on studying these days, but if I don't get a chance to study, I'll just push the exam date back and I'll study later. And that mindset, you just feeling like rescheduling is always an option, that can cause you to not stick to your study schedule. And so I want you to set an exam date and really just commit to it and say, I have to do whatever it takes to be ready to pass the exam by that date, because I'm on a path to passing this exam within 18 months, and I have to make that happen. So that's one thing that I want to share with you as well. So the next thing we're going to talk about is having a strategy. So now we'll talk a little bit about multiple choice question strategies. So we want you to get through these multiple choice questions as quickly as possible. And obviously you still want to try to get the answer correct, but we want you to move through them quickly because we want you to make sure you save enough time for the simulations. So one of the things that I'm going to skip down here just a bit, we want you to spend an average of about 1 minute and 15 seconds or even 1.5 minutes on each multiple choice question. Now, I want you to notice that I said average here. So I recognize that not every question can be completed in 1.5 minutes. There are some that actually may take you 3 or 4 minutes to solve. But there are also going to be other questions that you may recall that are things like glossary terms that may take 15 to 20 seconds to answer. And so It's not that you necessarily need to put a timer on each question and say, okay, I'm at 1 minute and 29 seconds. I just have to select an answer and move on. But you do want to have some milestones in place. So you may say something along the lines of, if you're trying to average 1.5 minutes per question, then once you're 30 minutes into your practice exam, you say, well, I need to be on question 15 to ensure that I'm on pace with that 1.5 minute average. And so just build in some milestones, not only for your practice exam, but even the actual exam. Set some milestones to say, here's where I need to be by the time the clock gets to this point, and that will help you ensure that you're making good progress on the multiple choice questions so that you save enough time to be ready to do those simulations. Now, another thing that I would recommend is to never leave a question blank. You want to guess it and then flag the question. Now, that seems pretty simple, but I want to tell you about a little experience I had. I was actually taking a different exam, and I got to a few questions that I didn't know the answer for. And so I said, you know what? I'm just going to flag these, and I'm going to come back and answer them later when I have more time to work on them. Well, as it turns out, I ended up running out of time. And so when I realized that my test lit was about to end, I tried to go back and answer those questions and just mark any answer. But I actually didn't even have time to do that. And so I submitted my exam with about 7 or 8 questions that were unanswered. In hindsight, I really wish that I had just marked an answer first and then flagged it and planned to come back to it if I have time. Because as it turned out, with me turning in that testlet with all 7 questions incomplete, I had a 0% chance of getting those correct. If I had just marked any answer, I would have at least had a 25% chance of getting those correct. And so aim to set yourself up for success, because we want you to go ahead and make a guess, then flag it. And that way, even if you don't have time to come back to it, you at least have a 25% chance of getting that question correct. So that's one thing we want you to do as well. Now, another reason we don't want you to spend too much time on the multiple choice, or not more than an average of 1.5 minutes, is because some of the questions that you take on the exam, about 15 to 20% of them are experimental and they don't count against your grade. Obviously, you will not know which questions are real and which ones are pretest questions, but essentially, the examiners are basically putting some questions on the exam, and they're basically trying to test it out on you to say, how would candidates respond to this if we were to put it on a future exam? And so part of the reason I say don't waste too much time is because if you get to a concept that seems unfamiliar or you don't recall studying, it could be one of these pretest questions. And so I don't want you to spend 7 or 8 minutes trying to figure out the answer. And then, because what happens there is a couple of things. Statistically, even if it takes you 7 or 8 minutes to answer a multiple choice question, there's a very low likelihood that you're going to get the answer correct anyway. And so a lot of times, if you're having that much trouble on a question, it's not likely that you're going to be very confident in your answer. And so you may waste that time and still get it wrong. Now, what the problem is with that is there may have been 3 or 4 other questions that you could have answered correctly in the same time that you wasted on that 7 or 8 minutes for that really tough question. And so I would say go ahead and just mark an answer, and then move on to the next one, because the other thing is this can also mentally derail you. Sometimes if you take too long on a question, like I said, 6, 7, 8 minutes, in the back of your mind, it's hard for you to let go. And you can't, even when you move on to the next questions, you're still thinking about this one. And so I want you to just move forward with a clear mind and say, you know what? I'm not worried about that last question. I'm focused on the next question. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so now I'm going to show you basically kind of a practice multiple choice question. And so what I want you to do is go ahead and read this question, and then we'll actually work through it. So just take, I guess just take a few seconds and read through this, and then I'll follow up with you. Okay, so before we start working on this question, I actually want to pause you for a second. I want you to ask yourself, how did you approach reading this question? So if you were like me, you probably started at the beginning with on January 1st, year one, a company purchased equipment for 100 million and then end up reading the rest of the question. What I want you to do is shift from doing that. I want you to read these questions a little bit differently. So what I want you to do is start with the stem of the question. So basically here, if I look at the end, I can see, okay, we're using the straight line method of depreciation, and under IFRS, they want to know what is the depreciation expense for the year ended December 31st of year one. So now that I know what they're actually asking me to solve for, now I can go to the beginning of the question and read through it, because now I have context for all these numbers they're throwing at me. What we typically do is start at the beginning, we read the question all the way through, and then when we get to the last sentence, we say, okay, they want to know depreciation expense. Oh, now I see what I need to look for. Let me go back now and reread the question now that I have that context. So the challenge with that is that you may end up spending an extra 15 to 20 seconds double reading questions. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about the fact that a lot of the exams have maybe 60 questions or 60 to 70 multiple choice questions, if you do that for every question, double reading them, you could be wasting 15 to 20 minutes. That's an entire extra simulation or two that you could have time for if you're not double reading questions. So I definitely want you all to consider starting with the end of the question, then reading the beginning. It will save you a lot of time if you can stop double reading questions. So that's one thing to be aware of now. So the other thing that I want to do is actually work through this question. So what we would do in this situation is, like I said, we look at under IFRS, they want to know what is the depreciation expense for the year ended December 31st. So we have to ask ourselves, what are they asking me to do? They want depreciation expense under IFRS. What do I need to know about that? Well, I need to know that IFRS uses component depreciation. Okay, so now let's look at our components, because now we know we're using component depreciation. So on year one, the company purchased equipment for $100 million, and there are four major components. Now, two of those components comprise 80% of the total cost. So now I'm going to do 80% times 100 million, and that gives me $80 million. Now they each have, they have a 20-year useful life. So now what I'm going to do is divide that 80 million by 20, and that's going to give me $4 million. So that's one piece of this question that I'm going to hold on to. We got $4 million up here, but there are two remaining components that I still have to solve for. They each have cost of $10 million, but they have different useful lives. And so the first one is for 4 years. So we're going to do 10 million divided by 4 years, and that gives us an additional $2.5 million. So if I add that to the 4 million up here from earlier, that gives me $6.5 million. But there's still one more component, that $10 million cost, and it has a useful life of 5 years. So 10 million divided by 5 is another $2 million. And so when I add the $2 million to the 6.5 million that we calculated earlier, because we're using the straight line method of depreciation, we're just adding all three of those numbers together. That is going to give us our final answer of $8.5 million. So that is how I want you to approach these types of multiple choice questions moving forward in the future. Start with the end of the question, find out what they're asking you, then read the beginning, because now you have the context to know the relevance of these numbers. If you can avoid double reading questions, it's going to save you a lot of time. And when you save time, it takes a lot of the pressure off, and it takes away some of that test anxiety that we sometimes feel. So that's something to be aware of as well. Now, another thing is, you're probably familiar with this, but there are multiple types of simulations. You have your regular task-based simulations. This is roughly the number. You can expect to see 2 or more of those on each section of the exam. Then you have your enhanced task-based simulations. They may be a little bit longer, maybe closer to the 20 to 30-minute range that it takes you to complete those. Well, sometimes people say, well, why are they so hard? It's not that the enhanced sims are harder. They just have more exhibits and more data to sift through. So a lot of times it takes longer to find the answer that you're looking for because you may have more calculations that you have to do or more exhibits to review before you can actually determine your answer. So just be aware of that. You'll probably see 1 to 2 of those on each of the exams. Then you'll have your document review simulation, which we'll address a little bit later. I'm going to show you an example. You also have your research simulation, where you'll be utilizing the authoritative literature and trying to find certain statutes and things like that. And then for the BEC section, you'll also have the written communication, which is somewhat like an essay portion of the exam. And so on the BEC, you will have 3 of those. That is the only section that has that's the only section that has the essay portion. So I wanted to give you a quick update on that. Now, here's an example of how I want you to, we talked about the strategy for the multiple choice question. Here's a strategy for the simulations. We're going to do the exact same thing. So again, we talk about how long these simulations take. Well, if you read through an entire simulation and then get to the bottom and see, okay, now I know exactly what I'm solving for, let me go back and reread it, that can add a lot of time as well. And so we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to zoom in here. So basically, they're saying for each of the variances in column A, here are the variances that are listed, complete the following using the information provided in the exhibits above. In column B, which is here, they want us to calculate the amount of the variance for the quarter ended June 30th of year 4. And they want us to enter all amounts as positive whole numbers. So I already know that all of these are going to be positive whole numbers. Now in column C, which is here, that's where they want us to identify, is this variance positive, or I'm sorry, is this variance favorable or unfavorable? So now I know what they're asking me to solve for. Now I can go back to the question and read it. And then now I can go to the exhibits and figure out what the answer is for each of these. Now for time purposes, I'm not actually going to go through and work this particular simulation just because it would, take a pretty long time to do that. But that is the formula for how I recommend approaching it in order to save time and be very structured. Because one of the other things that you'll notice, you may remember this from when you took the exam, oftentimes they will include irrelevant information in the body of the simulation and sometimes even in the multiple choice questions. And so it can be confusing if you're trying to remember all of this useless information because you don't know what you're actually going to need later. So if you can skip to the end and say, I know exactly what information I'm looking for, now let me read it. And when I come across something that's not really relevant to what I'm trying to solve for, I can just ignore it. And so that's something that can really be helpful for you as well. Here, you're probably already familiar with it, but you will have the authoritative literature available to you. So that's not something obviously that you need to memorize, but I do recommend familiarizing yourself with it, because if you are not familiar with it, sometimes it can actually take you longer to sift through the authoritative literature because you're just kind of on a scavenger hunt. And so I want you to be familiar with it, kind of know what you're looking for and be able to find that fairly quickly. Okay, so this is a document review simulation. Again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go down here and figure out what do they want us to do. They're telling us to revise this draft press release. And so this is the press release down here. And they're saying click on each segment of the underlined text. So like this is a segment of underlined text. This is another segment of underlined text. They want us to click on each of those. And then basically they want us to identify, is this statement accurate or does it need to be altered? So just as an example, if I were to click there, when I'm looking at this press release, they're saying that revenues for the second quarter of year 9 decreased 1331 or 8.5% to 18,254. So what they want to know is this statement accurate and we should keep the original text? Does this statement need to be deleted altogether? Or do we need to alter it slightly? Is the percentage just a little bit different? Is the final amount a little bit different? So they want us to figure out what makes this statement the most accurate. And the way to do that is by going and looking in the exhibits and determining, okay, based on the calculations I made, I would have come up with a different percentage than they came up with here. So maybe it wasn't 8.5%. Maybe it was 7.3 or 7.9. That's part of what they want you to solve for. So that is basically what you'll be doing in the document review simulations. And again, there'll be multiple statements like that throughout the particular document that they have you reviewing. So again, all of your exhibits are up here. And so you'll just want to utilize those to find the information that's relevant to the question they want you to solve for. Okay, we already talked about practice exams, so I'm going to skip through that. One thing that may be a little surprising is that we do not recommend studying on the day of your exam. So part of what we've done is, we give you a ready score that lets you know when you're ready to sit for the exam. So by the time you get to your exam date, you should have already studied, have a ready score that's an 80 or higher in our system, and that lets you know that you're ready. And so with that, you don't need to do a lot of last minute cramming on the day of your exam. What we find is that sometimes creates mental fatigue. And so you're going to be taking a 4-hour exam that day. We don't want your brain to be overly tired and exhausted because you were studying for 3 hours prior to the exam. So on the day of your exam, we want you to be in a cool, calm, and collected mindset. We want you to eat properly and just make sure that you are in a good position to be successful on your exam. But don't increase your anxiety by trying to get some last minute studying. Be confident that you have already studied, you have adequately prepared for this exam, and you will pass it. So that's one tip that I want to give you. The other thing is try not to arrive late, because in many cases they will not allow you to sit for the exam if you're late. But also, even if you are able to get in there, sometimes it just throws you off your game. I've been to places where I walked in and I technically was on time, but I felt very rushed. And as I began things, it kind of started it started things off just a little bit. I was off my game a little bit. Even if I was doing a presentation or something like that, anytime you're running late or running behind, it just mentally throws you off just a little. And so I want you to arrive early and make sure that that is not an issue for you. Also, make sure you bring all your proper IDs and your notice to schedule because you will need those. One update here, you can have your notice to schedule on your phone now. So it used to be that it had to be the actual sheet of paper for your notice to schedule, but you can now show them the NTS on your phone and that will be permissible as well. Okay, another thing here, talking about, how can you be more successful on your next attempt at this exam? Schedule your exam when it makes sense for you. What we mean by that is a couple things. So one, if you are someone who's working in tax, I would not recommend scheduling your exam anytime during busy season, because you know that that's not a great time to be able to study and take the exam. Another thing is thinking about the time of day. So I am a morning person, so I would love to take my exam as early as possible. So if it's 8 o'clock, whatever it is, 7 o'clock, whatever the earliest time they'll let me take it, that's probably when I like to do it, because that's when I'm clicking on all cylinders. Conversely, later on in the day may be a time that's not quite as optimal for me, because that's when I'm starting to feel a little tired. That's when I'm feeling more fatigued. And so for me, it would be unwise to schedule my exam at 3 p.m. or something like that, because I'm unlikely to be as effectively thinking and taking the exam as I could be. For other people, they're exactly the opposite. If you are not a morning person, you know that you don't need to schedule an 8 o'clock exam. Schedule it for the afternoon and make sure that you are setting yourself up for success based on the time and date that you are sitting for the exam. So the other thing is, I would also consider when you're scheduling when to take the exam, consider what else you have going on that day. If you are planning to work the first part of the morning and then you're going to take the exam in the afternoon, sometimes that has its challenges, because many times when I'm working, I plan to leave by noon or I plan to leave by 1 o'clock, and things come up. And sometimes I end up working longer or later than I intended. And so if you're that's the type of thing that can cause you to be late or just feel rushed or just have some heavy anxiety or angst over things that you didn't get to complete at work. So I would recommend saying, you know what, I'm just going to take off this complete day, or I'm going to take it on a Saturday or Sunday, and really just do it when my mind is clear and I don't have anything else to worry about that day. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Another thing is, I said leave your phone at home or in the car. So you can't have it in the actual testing center with you. So you would have to put it in your locker. But I recommend just leave it in your car unless you're using it for your NTS. I know sometimes you may be using your phone for GPS or something like that. So if you need to bring it and can't leave it at home, I would definitely say leave it in your car if possible, just to prevent yourself from having that distraction there. There on the Prometric website, it has some other rules and regulations, as well as on the NASBA site. They also have some items. But I think if you've already been there, you probably know the bulk of that. So I'll kind of skip over that part. One other thing that I want to make you aware of is something called ReadyPass. So ReadyPass is a product that we have that if you are not using our full CPA exam review course, you can actually take an assessment that identifies how ready you are to sit for the exam. And so if you just want to kind of gauge how are you performing, that may be something that you want to look into as our ReadyPass platform that you can find on surgentcpareview.com. So just wanted to give you that update as well. And with that, I will go ahead and pause here. And if you don't have any questions, please feel free to log off. And I certainly wish you the best on your next attempt. However, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat section or the Q&A section, and I will be glad to answer them. One last thing is that I am listing my email address here. And so please feel free to email me at hirshr@surgent.com if you have any questions, and I'll be glad to help. So it looks like I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, so I'll go ahead and log off. But again, I wish you the best on your journey to passing the CPA exam. And again, feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any additional assistance. So have a great night.